I first started making photographs as a teenager. I was probably 12 or 13 years old, and I was living at a time when getting a camera for a Christmas present was what most kids dreamed about. They didn't really dream about getting a computer. They dreamed about getting a single lens reflex, an SLR camera. And that's really when I began my interest in photography. The work that I'm going to show you here is from a body of work that I did from about 1980 through 1993, 1994, over about a 10 or 12 year period. And many of these prints are new prints that I've made in the last 2 years in preparation for an upcoming exhibition. These are large platinum palladium prints. And they're from a series called Natural Morte, which is the French for still life. And the series actually started quite innocently. One day I was walking through the woods across from my home in Lumberville, and I happened on a carcass of a deer that had died, and it was slowly melting into the earth. So I took my camera out and I started to photograph this deer as it slowly decomposed. And, you know, it was kind of difficult subject matter, and slowly I became more and more interested in it, and eventually started to bring the objects into the studio to photograph them. And I found that there was, for me, you know, great exquisite form and beauty to be found, and perhaps a touch of pathos. This is called Dancing Feet. And of course, as platinum prints, these are contact sheets, so the negative always has to be the same size as the print. Actually, one of the interesting things is that while I work in a 19th century medium, I'm just as comfortable in the 20th century digital world. I really have one foot in each century. And actually, for many of these prints, the original negatives were done with traditional film, but the large negatives were done digitally. So these are images that represent both the current technology, the digital technology, and also the 19th century technology. This is titled Barn Swallow's Web. I've always thought of myself as a directorial photographer. In other words, I basically build and construct the subjects that I'm going to photograph. You know, I'm not working like what I would call a window to nature photographer. I'm not out there photographing the world as I see it. I'm basically creating the world that I'm going to photograph. And these environments are built specifically for the photograph. And then obviously I take them apart afterwards. This is titled The Helix. And you know, we now know that the double helix is a basic element of life. It's in the DNA, it's the shape of the DNA. And you really find that shape in the sunflower, you find it in the ram's horn, you find it in the skull. It really is a repetitive shape that appears again and again in nature. And again, these are constructions. What I'm trying to do is build an environment that is believable. I really want the viewer to look at this and believe that it's a real environment, and hopefully to be fascinated by the shapes and the forms and the colors. You know, imagine trying to make any of these objects. I mean, how would you go about it? How could you make you know, a form as exquisite as that skull? And of course, we don't see it. You know, it's hidden during the life of the animal. We only see these forms after the animal dies. One day, I got up early in the morning, and I went outside from my house in Lumberville. My house is on the road, and there was an animal, a raccoon that had been killed, struck by a car. and it still had some of the qualities of life. It was really in this kind of transitional period. So I grabbed my view camera and I went outside and I started to photograph it. And this is the image. It's called The Sleep of Peace. And for me, it represents my own effort to try and somehow capture that greatest of all mysteries, that time or period between life and death. I mean, this is a time when life is leaving this animal, but somehow it isn't yet completely gone. So for me, this has always been a very successful and powerful image. And it has this kind of, certainly one of the most profound times in any of our lives, this moment of transition between life and death. A lot of the work that I was doing was being done with a 12 by 20 view camera. This is a camera that was actually built in order to do those large group portraits that you've seen from the early 20th century, early 20th century. It was 12 by 20 was the format. And I'd been working with this camera in large part because in order to make big prints, I needed to have a big negative. And one day I realized that the 12 by 20 format is actually a golden section rectangle. The Greeks were fascinated by numbers, and there was a great mysticism in the Greeks about the appropriate proportions for the perfect rectangle. And the Parthenon is built upon a golden section rectangle. And one of the things that's interesting about a golden section rectangle is that as you divide a square from the rectangle, what you get left is another golden section rectangle, and it becomes a kind of infinite arrangement. And this is titled the golden section, and it is one of these constructions again that really makes use of this really special rectangular shape. Of course, when you start photographing subject matter like this, people see it. And if they come across an object, they figure, gee, what can I do with this? Obviously, I should give it to Bruce. So one day, a friend of mine, Denver Lindley, went into his barn, and he found the carcass of a cat that had somehow died in the barn and had this really quite remarkable surface to it. So, of course, he knew the work I was doing, so he decided, gee, obviously I got to give this cat to Bruce. And what came is this photograph, which I call Joan and Denver's cat. And I'm kind of intrigued by this notion of making as exquisite and as beautiful an object out of something that we might consider to be really quite grotesque and quite ugly. Actually, I've always been interested in looking at things that other people want to turn away from. And I think that's one of the qualities that photographers have, is that desire to photograph something that hasn't been seen, the desire to photograph something that maybe no one else has ever seen, or to photograph things that people don't normally take the time to observe. Actually, one of the interesting stories about this photograph is that there was a poster done from it, and one day I got a call from the SPCA, and they had seen this poster and told me that the cat had obviously been shot with a shotgun. And I asked, how did they know that? And they pointed to the holes that were in the carcass. And of course their question was, they wanted to know if I had killed the cat in order to photograph it. And I assured them I didn't shoot the subjects that I photographed. On another occasion, a friend went into his wood stove, and the summer was over, and he was going to start a fire in the winter, and he discovered this group of birds that had somehow managed to get into his wood stove and died in the stove. So of course he called me, gave me the birds, and I organized this photograph titled Frozen Flight. You know, in the lower right, there is that figure of the woman, which had been lying in my studio, and I'd always wondered kind of how I might use it. And in this case, for me, it became this kind of force that kind of pushed out this bird into the space. And then on the upper right is this kind of monster figure that I organized. And you can see on the bottom of the image the burnt paper that came from inside the stove where the birds were found. The next photograph has to do with another friend who had a dog named Ensor. The dog had died, and I asked my friend if we could dig up the dog so that I could photograph the bones. And the photograph is titled Pieces of a Life. And this is basically all of the bones of a German Shepherd. And it's organized so that there is a narrative for me that's underneath the photographs. The circular patterns on the lower portion of the photograph represent some of the rigidity and the tradition of life, and the oval form becomes a kind of birth canal for the figure to be born. And then the hanging bones represent the kind of random uncertainty of life. We can never really predict where things are going to go. And on the far, your left is a bone that becomes the kind of face that watches the scene. You know, there's a lot of narrative for me underneath these photographs. I'm never convinced that the viewer knows what the narrative is, and I'm not sure that it's important that they do. I've never been interested in being too didactic about the work that I do. I don't want to specifically determine what the viewer is going to see. I want to get a reaction from the viewer. I think all artists want a reaction from the viewer. They want a response. I mean, I think for any artist, the most fateful thing is for people to be bored with the work that you do. I mean, artists want people to either love the work or to hate the work. And actually, in one sense, either emotion is fine because you're generating some kind of response. The next piece is titled Balancing Life. And it's a series of kind of totems. And these are reminiscent of the Mexican Week of the Dead or some of the ways in which other cultures will deal with dead objects and bones. Incidentally, I didn't mention that in many of these images you can see some of the brush marks from preparing the platinum paper. The next image is very personal. It was done in 1990, and it was actually done the week that my father died. There's a great line of Freud's that I've always found meaningful, and Freud said that the most important day in a man's life is the day his father dies. And the week that my father died, I wanted to make a photograph, and I was obviously emotionally struck by the events of the week. And this image, titled Homage to My Father, was made that week. And for me, I was concerned about the whole notion of the white light and moving to the white light and the kind of floating form, that skull that kind of floats upward towards the white light, with this sense of fear and mystery, because obviously all of us, as calm as we may be about death, there's the great uncertainty. We don't know what death means for any of us. And I think I certainly have a mixture of fear and wonder about what that will mean. And then the final print that I'll share with you from this series was actually made with a 20 by 24 camera. I actually built a 20 by 24 camera so that I could make even larger platinum prints. This was before the digital negatives were possible. Today you can make large platinum prints from digital negatives. And this is called the Cabinet of Dr. Photo. And it's obviously a takeoff on the surrealist film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Or you can think about one of the paintings that has always intrigued me, you know, is the artist in his studio, the Rembrandt Peale painting, where he pulls back the curtain and reveals the objects that are hidden. And this is basically a collection of these objects that I had collected over the years, placed and organized together, not really in any kind of scientific order, but really more in an artistic order. And for me, this has always been one of my more satisfying images. So those are some samples of the work from Natural Morte, as I said, done over about a 12-year period with a collection of new prints.